Hey guys, it's Will from Tested.
And it's Norm from Tested.
Norm, a lot of tablets are out now, but the new parentheses 2013 edition of the Nexus 7 is out by ASUS.
This is the tablet, the small 7-inch tablet that everyone wants. It's Google waited until after I/O to release it, and it's been out since the end of July. So we've been using it for about a month now. You have one, I have one, and I have a hodgepodge of Android devices in front of me. I want to talk about all of these, but primarily this thing, which is the new Nexus 7.
Yeah, it's a really nice looking tablet. Like you said, we've both been using it for about a month. I find it to be, I really like the 16:9 aspect ratio on this tablet in particular.
It's 16 by 10.
16 by 10, same difference. I mean, all intents and purposes, when you're holding your hand, it's long and narrow.
It is much longer and narrow than, for example,
say an iPad
Mini, which is...
It's chunky. It's
very,
fat.
Very fat and chunky. An iPad Mini is actually a 7.9-inch display. This is a 7-inch display. Let's talk about, first of all, what the differences are between this year's Nexus 7 and last year's Nexus 7, which we also liked at the time. So 2012's Nexus 7 was announced at I/O, and it was a big shocker because it was a Nexus device, 7 inches, and $200 was the big selling point.
It was their first Nexus tablet. For all, I mean, I guess they announced this 10 at the same time.
Yeah, they had Nexus 10 as well, and then of course later in the year you had the 4, 7, and 10 as the lineup.
But this was also something new because it was a 7-inch tablet that had an OS that was designed for a 7-inch tablet, and it actually worked really well. Like it was a good device for reading. It was good for watching videos, and it was also really cheap. Like it was at the time the cheapest good tablet you could get.
The price was the big selling point for the Nexus 7, and you could, because of that $200 price, which is unheard of at that time, you could excuse a few things about the Nexus 7.
You know, I think that you shouldn't excuse anything for a low price.
Well, absolutely, not this day and age. Absolutely not.
But it was an 8 gig device, which if you're just streaming stuff on the web and just reading stuff and reading books and things like that, it's more than enough space. And
had your front camera for people who want to do their Google Hangout calls. And you know, later on, $200 got you 16 gig version. Over time, though, at the end of the year, Apple of course released the iPad Mini at $330. And over time, people found performance on the Nexus 7 a little lacking in terms of just how responsive the apps were loading. Once you'd use it for about 6 months, the apps would kind of bog down, multitasking would get a little slow. And I did read a lot of people who bought the Nexus 7 on impulse because it was so cheap at the time, and then put it in their drawer and really never use it again.
It was the kind of thing that if you had kids, it would be a great thing to hand off to the kids after you'd done your 6 months with it, and when you decided you need to get the bigger one or whatever.
Just by saying that, it kind of acknowledges the fact that it is not a flagship product. It is more of a compromise product. So you mean they had to compromise some things for price.
The motto isn't Android, it's for kids?
No, Android is not for kids.
I'm kidding.
Android's for adults too. So this year we have the new Nexus 7, and it is almost in every single attribute an improvement on last year's Nexus 7, including the price being jacked up. I guess that's not really an improvement. So this is $230, as opposed to this one launching at $200.
And what happened with that one was it launched at $200 for an 8 gig model, and then really quickly after that they replaced it with a 16 gig model. It was still $200, right?
Still $200.
So this launched with a 16 gig only model. But the first thing really you notice about it is it's a lot smaller and thinner than
I don't want to
keep
people notice, but it's definitely the screen. The screen is the biggest improvement, in my opinion. It is a 1920 by 1200 resolution, 16 by 10 screen, which, as far as I could tell, is the first small tablet in this category with that high resolution. We're talking about on the old Nexus 7, 1280 by 800, and then on even the iPad Mini, 1024 by 768, which doesn't look bad, but when you're talking about as high resolution as 1920 by 1200, your use cases change a lot.
So what's the pixel density at 1920 by 10?
I think it's about 323. It's over 300, which is plenty fine.
More than you'll ever be able to tell.
Yeah, it's not as high pixel density, for example, as the 1920 by 1080 HTC One, but unless you're like putting your eye really close to the screen, you're not going to be able to see the pixels.
One of the things I noticed is that especially compared to the iPad Mini, reading text on that display is much closer to a Retina iPad or like even the e-ink or something like that. I mean, it's still transmissive, not reflective, but the resolution is very, very high.
And you attribute that to both the resolution of the screen and also the way the software renders the text.
Of course.
So the software is rendering text very well, making use of a high resolution screen. So what does high resolution screen give you? It gives you wonderful looking images. So for example, if I pull up a photo from Flickr, some photos from Comic-Con or something, here goes something. They look really wonderful. I know you're not going to be able to exactly tell difference on the 720 feed video here, but it's incredible high detail. It's an IPS screen.
Okay, I was going to ask, yeah.
And the colors, even compared to something like this, the colors, like the off-axis viewing angle.
They both look about the same on the screen, but in person you can actually see a noticeable difference.
Much better on the new Nexus 7.
And that really comes into play when you're in landscape mode and you're like trying to watch a movie with two people or something like that. Is the place that it shows for me.
Also, because you have a high resolution screen on this desktop, on the home screen, you get to do things like, for example, put many more icons on the screen. You get to have your widgets, your calendar widgets, and even your mail widgets. Right now I have this full mail widget, but normally I actually have it set up so I have 2 mail widgets, and even with a half screen mail widget, I can have 1 mail account on the top, 1 mail account on the bottom, and fill up plenty more icons on the screen than I would have than on a phone, for example.
That sounds pretty good, Norm. Anything you don't like about the screen? Well, I'll tell you the thing I don't like about the screen.
You don't think it gets dim enough?
I think a lot of stuff doesn't get dim enough, but I think that this tablet also falls in that category.
Right, so when a lot of people review tablets and anything with its screen these days, they look for the brightness. And if we show on here, I can show you the maximum brightness. We have it turned off. Auto brightness right now. I'm at like 25% brightness. It's going to get blown out on the camera here at maximum brightness, but this is bright enough to use to read in the sunlight. Yeah, which is important.
Absolutely. Like I walked down to the beach the other day. It works great even in beach sunlight in the summertime. Now the bad news is that when you're laying in bed and it's dark and you want to have no lights on and your significant other is laying asleep next to you, it's still crazy bright. It's not going to show on the screen here because we're in a studio lighting situation.
Right, but if all the lights were off, this would be too bright for you.
It's much brighter than, say, with the iOS devices, you can go all the way down until the backlight is almost entirely off. Now, there's software hacks that let you get around this. There's a free piece of software called Screen Filter that will, I think it doesn't actually make the backlight any dimmer. I think it just adds more black to the overall screen. There's also stuff like Flux, and there's an app called Lux Auto, which automatically gives you more granularity in the brightness controls than default Android, which is one of the benefits of Android, is that you have stuff that can access at a low level and fix those kind of problems if you have them.
So physically, the Nexus 7 also has changed from this year's model, from last year's model. It's a little bit taller, and if you can see,
you mean a little bit? Yeah, a little. It's longer.
It's longer height-wise.
Right.
So if I stack them, you can actually see the Nexus 7.
It's like the Big Brother
on top. And some people have complained. They think the forehead and the chin are a little too big. I think it's fine. I think I can hold it from the bottom like that with one hand.
Well, and since the buttons are touchscreen on the touchscreen, it's important that you have some space on the bottom
to hold on the bottom. And I don't think that the top has too much. It's very narrow on the sides. It actually has a thinner bezel on the side than the old Nexus 7, right there. And of course, it is a thinner and lighter tablet.
It is. I mean, the first thing I noticed before I even turned it on when I took it out of the box is how much thinner and lighter it is than the old Nexus 7.
Yeah, so
and I think also than the Mini, right? The iPad Mini.
It is actually a little thicker than the Mini, but lighter.
Okay.
If you have an old Nexus 7 and you look at the edge here, there's a gradient between the top gray part and like the middle gray part. The thickness of the new Nexus 7 basically goes up to that dividing line in the gradient right here. So if you have the old one and you're considering the new one, it's that much thinner. It's less beveled than the old one. The old one had this like matte, like fake rubberized plastic texture, and if you can see on the old one, it was actually really curved on this left and right side. The new one, it's a little sharper, a little bit of bevel, but it's a little less, and it's a little sharper on the sides, thinner. If you compare it to something like, for example, the iPad, though, iPad is definitely wider. Switch this off. iPad is technically still thinner. So
it doesn't feel any thinner, though.
It's like 7 millimeters here and 8.5 millimeters on the Nexus. Yeah, if you put them side by side, the iPad's thinner, but the Nexus is actually lighter because there's less mass here.
Well, and the benefit is because of the narrower aspect ratio, you're actually able to hold it in one hand very comfortably, like palm the whole tablet.
Yeah, and I actually don't hold it.
Whereas that's hard to do with the iPad.
I don't hold it from the sides, the bevel, like I do, for example, with the iPad, the larger iPad. I'm holding it from the bottom, and it's light enough just to grip from the bottom and do your reading. And
I laid in bed and held it palm. Just
you can totally,
it's totally comfortable. You can do it indefinitely.
Just grip like that.
Yeah. I mean, that works great for me.
And it's not going to
slide. And then you kind of just, with the Kindle app or things that use page turning smartly,
I mean, you just tap the middle. You could kind of do it
with
this one, but this one was a little chunkier. This at 290 grams, much lighter,
Yeah.
and it's very noticeable.
It's a nice piece of hardware. I mean, that's the big change.
So let's talk about what's inside here.
Okay.
It is last year was a Tegra 3. And it was 1.2 gigahertz quad-core Tegra 3. One of the cores could go up to 1.3 gigahertz.
So there's actually a fifth secret core, right?
And there's a fifth, low-power core.
Bonus core or whatever.
They're not using Tegra 4 for many reasons. I'm sure there was some business relationship stuff.
Is this indicative of problems NVIDIA's having with ARM stuff?
I have no idea, because the Shield, from all indications, using Tegra 4 is very fast and very capable. Could have been for cost, but Qualcomm and Texas Instruments no longer makes this amount of chips. So Qualcomm Snapdragon in here.
Okay.
It is a Snapdragon, technically the S4 Pro, and it's running. It's basically a Cortex A9 Crate processor running at 1.5 gigahertz. So,
but there's speculation that this is a Q6 that's underclocked, right?
So the Snapdragon, Qualcomm has multiple Snapdragons, and S4 Pro is probably the most popular version of the Snapdragon, especially the ones running at the 1.5 gigahertz. 2 gigs of RAM. If you look at those specs, it looks very similar to what's here, which is the Nexus 4, which came out at the end of last year. Also, Qualcomm S4 Pro. But what people have found out is that the Qualcomm S4 Pro in here and the one in here are actually different. In the Nexus 4, there's actually running the Crate 200 series. And then here, it's actually the Crate 300 series.
So what changes?
There's new instructions and new process, 28 nanometer process. And I don't want to go into all the technical details. Frankly, I don't know all the technical details. But clock for clock, even though these are both 1.5 gigahertz machines, people say that this is probably 15% faster on face just in the system and chip. Because it's using the Crate 300 series.
So benchmarks and all that stuff obviously are important, especially on Android. But what really matters to me is how it actually performs in the real world.
So in combination of using the S4 with the Crate 300, also this has a Adreno 320 at 400 megahertz for graphics. My worry was that when I saw the specs for this and this,
for the Nexus 7,
and Nexus 4, the Nexus 4 has a small, low resolution screen. It's 1280 by 768. And with a higher resolution screen, you would think, okay, if they have the same processor and the same graphics, it's going to get slower on the higher resolution screen because you have to push more pixels and for things like games. But because it's actually not the same processor, and because there's faster memory here, it's 1600 megahertz DDR3 as opposed to the DDR2 in here, and a different memory controller. The performance on the Nexus 7 actually faster than on the Nexus 4 in all benchmarks. Including games, including running full resolution in games.
How does it feel, Norm?
It feels like no compromise.
Same speed as you get with your HTC One.
I would say, if you really scrutinize it, it's still a little slower than the HTC One. And HTC One does have the Snapdragon 600 at 1.7 gigahertz, and so this is slower clock than the HTC One.
And also an older processor versus the newer processor.
It's actually, I think they're technically the same, just different brands.
Okay.
What people speculate is that this is actually the S600, but with clocked at 1.5 gigahertz.
Okay.
So, and they have comparable resolution screens. This one actually has more pixels. So, in benchmarks, in terms of speed, it's going to be HTC One is the fastest, then the Nexus 7, the new Nexus 7, then the Nexus 4, and then the last year's Nexus 7, which really trails by. I'm going to do a quick demo right here. It's demo time. If we just load up a web browser, I'm going to show you on both the Nexus 7s how fast Chrome loads.
That seems pretty fast.
And I'm going to hit the home buttons to show you.
We'd have to bust out the high speed to see the difference in that. But
I think you could.
It is
you could tell.
A couple of fractions of a second.
It's loading much faster. I mean, you would need the high speed to see the responsiveness.
Well, the scrolling
on the left and right. It is looking at it less stuttery on the left side than on the right side.
It's tough to say. I found that this was much faster. This felt much faster, even on stuff like page turning animations in the Kindle app. On the new Nexus 7, the 2013 Nexus 7 versus the 2012 one. However, it doesn't feel quite as buttery smooth as like my 4th gen iPad.
Right, and a lot of people are worried that because you're running games at potentially full 1920 by 1200 resolution, you're going to get lower frame rates.
Is that how Android handles games on high resolution? Everything runs at native?
Wow. It depends on the game. But some games will scale to native without the option to change. I'm running a 3D Mark on Android right now, the Ice Storm Extreme
This
demo.
is a benchmark, right?
And this is a benchmark, but talking about games like Epic Citadel and even 3D Mark, you're going to get 20 to 30 FPS at full resolution, and right here, like 30 FPS, it looks wonderful, and the benchmark might not even load on the old Nexus 7. Oh, running up. It's going to give me an error.
It's going to crash
I did it all last night, got an error. Oh, yeah, maybe. But it looks wonderful on the new Nexus 7. I'm going to pop out of here right now.
Do you find yourself playing games with it?
I'm not a big Android gamer. The games I do play are 2D, so it doesn't really affect me.
Okay.
But one thing I did notice is that running graphics demos on the HTC One and the Nexus 7, HTC One got very, very warm. Nexus 7, because it's spread out, not as warm.
Oh, so that makes sense.
Not nearly as hot playing a game, playing a high graphic game on the Nexus 7 as on the phone.
Can we talk about the back? We skipped over this when we were talking about but it's a different material on the back, and I think it's the same as the back of the Nexus 4, right?
I think it's actually the same material but different texture. So they're both plastic backs, and if you can kind of see on the old Nexus, which is on top, there's these little dots on them. So they're both kind of like a fake rubberized plastic.
The new one feels a lot grippier. It feels kind of soft in your hand.
It's maybe a better process to make it rubberized plastic. It's still plastic. Yeah, I mean, you could still scratch this up with a key if you really wanted to.
I wouldn't do that if I were you.
But it is. It's grippy in the sense that holding it is comfortable.
Okay.
I mean, it's also done so it doesn't slide off. For example, a charging pad, which we'll talk about in just a second.
Okay. So what else is in the box? 16 to 32 gigs of storage.
Yeah, the options are 16 gigs or 32 gigs. 16 gigs is $230. 32 gigs, $270.
So it's basically $100 difference between the iPad Mini and this, as the iPad Mini stands
for
today.
the 16 gigs.
For the 16 gigs.
And then while there will be an LTE version in the future, Google hasn't announced exactly when that'll be or what the pricing will be.
But it's one SKU gives you LTE. AT&T and Verizon in the US.
Yeah, just SIM card. The cellular chip in here basically covers 90% of all the spectrums. In China, someone has picked up an LTE Nexus 7, and the price there was the equivalent of about $330 US, which means it'll be smart, because that means with $330 you can buy either an iPad Mini with no cellular or Nexus 7 with cellular.
So, and for people in the European zone, there's a separate version that has the appropriate bands for Euros as well. So.
There's also in the new Nexus 7 a camera on the back. So while
that's new. Both
of them had cameras in the front for your FaceTimes, or I guess your Google Hangouts, the Android equivalent of FaceTime or Skype.
Yeah.
There's now also a camera on the back. It's 5 megapixels. I'm going to show you an image I just took with the camera. Now,
how do you feel about people who take pictures with tablets, Norm?
You know what? I don't mind. They can do it. I know a lot of people who do that now. You can tell that the photo is not great. It's super grainy.
There's a lot of noise on the background, yeah.
And this is in really decent lighting. But if they're going to do it, they're not going to change their ways, and now they have the option to do it.
Right. Well,
which they did before.
When you're doing a Hangout or Skype call or something like that, you can flip around and use the other camera and show what your dog's doing, or baby, or whatever.
Sure. And in terms of a Skype call, there's going to be more than high resolution enough to process that 720p video.
What's the front-facing camera? I haven't actually done a Hangout with
It's a 1.2 megapixel camera, which is the same as the front on the last year's.
Okay.
So that's basically it. Battery life. There's actually a smaller capacity battery in this year. That they probably did that for the weight and size than last year's.
How does battery life compare to last? Because last year's had a pretty good battery when you were using it. I found that the kind of shelf life battery when it's sitting on your nightstand unplugged is maybe not awesome.
And that just depends. It is a purely case-by-case basis for that. Both of these launched with claims of 9 hours of battery life. I got 8 hours of Wi-Fi browsing.
Okay, just sitting on your couch using the web.
Browsing with a strategic every 15 minutes change the page.
Okay.
Streaming 9 hours of video streaming on YouTube.
That's pretty good.
Which is excellent.
Yeah.
Overnight, the way I use it, so I just don't think about it, put it in sleep mode. Wi-Fi is still on. I can still get notifications. There's a pulsing white light in the bottom.
When you say put it in sleep mode, you mean hit the power button so it turns off?
Hit the sleep button on top. Yeah. It decreases about 5% battery every night. There are applications, and there's even a setting in Android for you to disable all connectivity when it's in sleep mode. But that means you won't get your notifications.
Right.
And there are apps that say, overnight you can disable your Wi-Fi overnight. That will probably give you a little bit more battery life. But I will say that across all these Android devices, in standby, they do not last as long as iOS devices.
Right.
So iOS just has battery management.
But it probably also has to do with the way they handle push notifications versus always on in the background apps.
These are devices that I charge at the minimum every 3 days. Well, with something like a full iPad or even iPad mini, you can go legitimately a week without using it in the drawer and still pull it up a week later and it'll still have like a 50% charge.
Right. Whereas with my Nexus 7, if I don't plug it in, like you said, 3 or 4 days seems to be it.
Yeah.
It'll be dead when you come back, and that's kind of a bummer.
Yep.
Can we talk about the charging stand? I think that's pretty cool.
So this is also new on the Nexus 7. It was on Nexus 4.
And it's not any special magic. It's a standard. It's a proprietary standard, but it's a standard nonetheless.
Yep. So Google has adopted the Qi standard of charging.
It's QI.
QI. It is one of the shortest, most valuable phrases in Scrabble you can use.
Okay.
And it's not magnetized, so this is just a rubberized grip. There is actually no magnet on the Nexus 4. So Nexus 4 popped here. It's actually charging right now. And the Nexus 7 popped here. Doesn't really slide off. I mean, you can knock it off if you want it to, but it's still also, if you can see in the bottom corner, that is now charging.
Do you have problems does it have to be in the right spot or anything like that, or does it automatically go there?
The pad is around this big. It's a circular pad on the back. So if you put it, for example, here, which actually wouldn't even sit on here, it wouldn't charge. It's right in the middle, but it's big enough that you just plop it on, that's going to charge. For example, right now, charging. That was a very carefree plop. There are other Qi charging pads that aren't in this shape.
There's a ton of them. Yeah.
There's one that's flat. I actually recommend the flat one over the Nexus one. This one makes more sense for the phone.
Right.
If you're putting the phone right here and you want to use it as like a clock.
And if you're buying one of those larger pads, you want to make sure that it'll do multiple devices at once, because you don't want to be able to have to just do your tablet or your phone.
Put both devices on.
How long did it take to charge? How long does it take to charge on the wire or on the stand? On
the charging pad, it's a 5-volt charger. It's a low watt charger, and it charges about 5% every 15 minutes or so.
Okay, so figure 4 hours to charge the whole thing, 5 hours.
When it's plugged in directly, then it charges much faster. And of course, the battery works out, so the 20% to 80% charges really quickly. The first 20% takes a while, and the last 20%.
It's the normal lithium-ion rules.
Also take a while. It is normal lithium-ion rules. It is micro USB on the back.
Okay.
There's no expandability, no micro SD slot or anything. The micro USB, if you buy a slim port adapter, that's going to be a different standard than the MHL adapter.
So slim port is to get HDMI out of a USB. I mean,
so there are dongles that are micro USB to HDMI. You plug that in, you'll get mirroring.
Why on earth are there two standards for that same thing?
I don't know.
Bananas.
But that is what Google uses now. Same with Nexus 4.
Okay.
That's slim port, and then also it works as like a USB host.
Yeah, so you can plug in like a thumb drive or a card reader, or even like a gamepad if you want to get crazy.
But you would need the right micro USB adapter.
Right. Or you need a micro USB to USB female, like the big, like the one on the back. Basically, you need to put a port that's like the one on the back of your computer. It's a really weird dongle.
Yeah.
But I mean, I did find playing games with the Xbox game controller on the Nexus 7, the original Nexus 7, was kind of weird. Like you could play Max Payne.
Yeah.
On the
I
Nexus
wouldn't really
7.
want to do that.
It's not great.
No.
But
for memory card, you buy the dongle and you can plug in like a SD card reader.
So you can grab your photos.
Save, bring that laptop on the airplane.
Okay.
I think that this device has no compromises.
You feel like after using it for a month, I think I probably spent less time with it than you did. I really like it a lot. I think it is a really, really good 7-inch tablet.
Comes with Android 4.3.
Yeah.
And I mean, Android is mature enough at this point. You have multiple users. You have even protected user stuff.
Like kid accounts, basically.
It does 1080p for Netflix on here.
How many movies did you see with 1080p? I saw practically nothing with 1080p.
It depends on your connection, and it all doesn't really make that much of a difference. Right. But the fact that you can, it will work with like the Chromecast pushing 1080p out to that as well. $230 is a great price.
I mean, no matter what happens with iPad Mini this fall, if they release especially if they don't release a Retina iPad Mini, this is the winner for the year on tablets if Apple doesn't release an iPad Mini.
There's no way. I mean, on the Apple front, and again, this is like a ecosystem thing. I mean, they're very different tablets. Some people, on a philosophical basis, like the aspect ratio of the iPad.
I mean,
they like the wider screen for web browsing. You know, even in Chrome web browsing on the Nexus 7, I don't feel like this is too narrow.
I have to say, switching back and forth between them, because that's what I've been doing for the last month, not having to tap into Zoom on the iPad mini is nice, but it's totally offset by the low resolution screen, which means you want to tap into Zoom to see the font better, because it's usually too hard to read. I even find myself rotating the iPad mini to landscape to read sideways. I never ever do that with the Nexus 7, which is really good. The other thing is, though, the reading experience, because of the brightness and having to fiddle with a third-party app, is kind of crappy for the times that I'm going to be laying in bed reading a book, which is the only time I do like recreational reading. And
on the other side, for the people who do like reading in landscape mode, the iPad mini is going to be better for them because they get more vertical space.
Yeah,
and they're going to have to scroll less on this, you know, as opposed to reading a web page.
I would never read in landscape on the Nexus 7. I've left it in portrait and in locked orientation since I got it.
Great portrait device. Yeah. So 2 variables for Apple later this year. If they come out with a new iPad mini, which everyone expects them to, one is going to have a Retina display, a high resolution, basically a quadruple number of pixels as here.
So it'll be the same resolution as
1536.
The iPad 3 and 4.
Right. And 2, whether the price is going to stay the same.
Right.
Even if the price stays the same and they go Retina, which would mean has same comparable resolution as the Nexus 7, it's still $330.
It's still $100 more than the comparable iPad, than the comparable Nexus 7.
Than the comparable Nexus.
I mean, this is a can't be beat deal. The only reason I would look at iPad minis in this, especially right now, before we know what happens, is if you really absolutely have some iOS apps that are exclusive that you have to get.
Yes, and Google services are all tied in wonderfully as is the case on all Android devices. This is not a tablet that 1 year later people are going to say they shove in their drawer and they're not using. Like this, I use every day now instead of the phone, instead of the full-size iPad.
Well, and the thing you mentioned about Google services is important, because if you look at my home screen on my iPad, it's probably 2/3 Google services, and then messages and Safari's there just for when Chrome doesn't work for whatever reason. Like having the services integrated is really nice, especially the Google Now stuff, which behaves a little bit differently on iOS than Android, and it's much better on Android. The experience is much better.
Yep.
So there were a couple bugs that people found, a couple problems people had.
People have reported that there was a GPS bug.
That actually happened to me.
So sometimes GPS works for 5 to 10 minutes, and after that it just loses the signal, and people have the hard reset. The other bug is a phantom touch bug. In certain cases, if you're touching somewhere on the screen, it will register a touch somewhere else, and users have been able to duplicate this using low-level debugging software and apps. I have not encountered the touch bug myself, but it's something that Google actually has acknowledged and said that they're investigating. I don't think it's a deal breaker, but we don't know as of yet if it's a hardware bug or a software bug.
For me, it only happened once when I did the hard reset. It's never happened again. I haven't used GPS a ton. Can you root and unlock the bootloader with this?
You can totally unlock the bootloader. Okay. You can sideload, do whatever you want.
That's fantastic.
It is a Nexus device.
Yeah.
And when the LT version comes, I expect you to be able to pop in your micro SIM from, or your mini SIM from any phone and be able to use tethering and all that stuff.
Fantastic. So again, it's $230 for the 16 gig version. How much more for the
$270 for
so $40 more.
I'd say if you're planning on using this for a full year and you have a lot of media, if you sync stuff on Spotify or audio, pay the extra $40.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes about $300 with shipping and tax.
Right.
In the US at least.
Right. It's a great tablet. We like it a lot. I think it's the best Android device I've used to date. So there we go.
Well done. The Google Nexus 7 gets the clap.
The
well done.
Clap. Nice
job,
guys.
Well done, Nexus 7.
We'll be back with more from Tested.com soon. I'm Will.
I'm Norm.
See you guys later.
Bye.